The evening was slowly settling over the small cafe, rushing the windows with the soft glow of the setting sun. Inside, everything felt warm and calm. The scent of fresh pastries still hung in the air, mixing with the faint smell of roasted coffee beans that had soaked into the walls over the years. A few customers sat scattered at the tables, some chatting quietly, others lost in their own thoughts or scrolling on their phones. It was one of those evenings where nothing extraordinary was expected to happen. The world outside looked almost sleepy. No one imagined that a single person stepping through the door could change the mood of the entire place. The cafe door creaked open gently, making a soft bell ring above it. Most people barely noticed. But slowly, a few pairs of eyes lifted, curious. A thin young man stood just inside the doorway, as though unsure whether he should come in at all. His clothes were worn from time and weather, and his shoes looked like they had traveled far more miles than they were meant to. He wasn't dirty, just tired, the kind of tired that sat not only on his face, but deep in his eyes. As if the weight he carried was heavier than anything he could put into words, he held the door for a moment longer, as if debating whether to step forward or turn around and leave. The evening air curled in behind him, and with it came a brief chill. A few customers blinked, curious but not alarmed. The young man finally let the door close behind him and took one slow step forward, then another. He didn't rush. He didn't seem to know where he was supposed to go. He glanced around first at the menu board, then at the glass counter where pastries sat neatly on display, then at the small round tables. But his eyes lingered longest on the old upright piano in the corner, a piano that had once been the pride of the cafe, but was now mostly decoration. The piano was scratched around the edges, its polish worn away by years of sunlight and the touch of many hands. It hadn't been played in weeks. Sometimes a child tapped its keys after school, or a traveler pressed a short tune before moving on. But no one had made real music on it for a long time. Still, the young man looked at it in a way that was different from anyone else. There was something almost familiar in the way he stared at it, like he was greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in years. The cafe staff noticed him standing there. One of the workers, wiping down a counter near the register, watched him with a cautious but gentle curiosity. The young man walked forward slowly, almost timidly. When he finally reached the counter, he stopped. He swallowed hard, as if gathering courage for something difficult. "Excuse me, ... He began softly. His voice was quiet, not shaky in fear, but shaky in the way someone sounds when they've been silent for a long time. The worker leaned closer, trying to hear him better. The young man looked down at his hands, then back up. He took a breath. I'm sorry to bother you," he said gently. "But would it be okay if I played your piano? Just for a little while?" The worker blinked in surprise. That was definitely not what they expected. No one ever walked in asking that, especially not someone who looked so uncertain. The young man's eyes lowered again before he added, in the smallest voice, "I haven't eaten today. If it's all right, I could play a song, maybe a few, in exchange for something to eat. Only if it's okay." The cafe grew a little quieter, as if everyone nearby was listening even without meaning to. The request wasn't loud or desperate. If anything, it was humble, as though he believed even asking was too much. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for special treatment. He didn't even ask for a full meal, just food. And he offered something in return, something he clearly hoped had value. The worker hesitated, not because they wanted to refuse, but because they didn't quite know the right response. They studied him, really looked at him, and noticed the way he kept his shoulders slightly drawn in, like someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. His hands were thin, but his fingers looked long and gentle, like they were meant to create rather than break. "Play?" The worker asked softly, just to be sure. The young man nodded. Barely. The cafe owner, who had been sitting at a small table counting receipts, overheard the exchange and stood up. The owner wasn't harsh or intimidating, just practical, the kind of person who had run the cafe long enough to know when something unusual was happening. They stepped closer. "You want to play the piano?" the owner asked, not unkindly. The young man turned toward the voice and nodded. If that's all right. I don't want to cause trouble. I can play. And maybe it could be worth something. Enough for a sandwich. Or anything, really. I'm not picky." There was a pause, a small, delicate moment where something like a silent conversation passed between the owner and the young man. The owner saw the truth right there in his eyes. He wasn't lying. He wasn't trying to take advantage. He genuinely wanted to earn what he was asking for. "You don't have to play for food," the owner said gently. "If you're hungry, we can get you something to eat." The young man shook his head quickly, almost panicked, as if refusing kindness had become a habit. "No, please. I don't want to take without giving something back. I can play. I promise. Just let me try." His voice cracked on that last word, not from emotion, but from exhaustion. He was someone who had been holding himself together for far too long. The owner took a breath and finally nodded. "All right. You can play." A wave of relief washed across the young man's face, though he tried to hide it. He gave a small, grateful bow of his head. "Thank you," he whispered. He walked toward the piano with careful steps, as if approaching something sacred. The cafe's old wooden floor creaked beneath him. A couple at a nearby table paused their conversation, watching with growing interest. Another customer slowly lowered their phone, curious about what was happening. The young man reached the piano and stopped. His hand hovered over the polished but faded wood. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing in quietly, his fingers barely grazing the surface. It looked almost like he was afraid to touch it too quickly, as though he might break the moment by moving too fast. He lifted the piano lid with slow, respectful care. The keys were slightly yellowed with age, but they were all intact. He stared at them as if greeting something familiar that he had once loved deeply. He pulled out the bench and sat. He didn't straighten his back like a professional musician. He didn't position himself with confidence. He sat simply, like someone who had lived many days unsure where he belonged. His shoulders slouched and his feet tucked lightly under the bench. For a moment, he didn't play. He just rested his hands in his lap and closed his eyes. The cafe was quiet. A few spoons clinked against cups. Someone whispered. But the atmosphere shifted, as though everyone sensed something unusual was about to happen, even if they didn't understand what or why. The young man lifted his hands and placed his fingers gently on the keys. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves exactly, but from the weight of everything he carried. He took one deep breath. He was about to play, but before a single note sounded, something happened inside him, a memory, a feeling, something he hadn't allowed himself to touch in a long time. It flickered through him like the faint spark of a candle that refuses to go out. Behind him, the cafe owner watched, quietly wondering who this stranger really was. The customers, sensing the stillness, started to pay attention. Even those who had been busy on their laptops or lost in their thoughts slowly lifted their eyes. No. One said a word. The young man's fingers pressed the keys, not yet in music. Just a single, gentle touch. The sound was soft, almost like a whisper. But even that tiny sound carried something fragile in it, like the beginning of a story no one knew they were about to hear. The young man breathed out slowly. This was the moment. The moment before everything changed, before the music, before the gasps, before the applause, before the videos, before the story would travel further than he had ever imagined. All he wanted was a meal. But in the next few seconds, when his fingers truly began to move, he would give the cafe something far greater, something unforgettable, and not a single person there. Not even the young man himself knew yet just how deeply that first note would echo. The young man sat at the piano bench for a moment longer, as if gathering the courage he needed to let the music finally begin. The cafe was still. The workers had paused whatever they were doing. The customers leaned slightly forward without even realizing it. Even the air felt different, like everything had slowed down and shifted its attention toward him. He took a small breath and finally let his fingers move. The first true notes drifted out, soft and gentle, almost like he was greeting the keys after a long separation. The sound floated across the cafe, wrapping around each table and easing into every corner of the room. It wasn't loud or showy. It was tender, almost shy, yet filled with something that felt deeply real. The owner, standing by the counter, felt their shoulders slowly relax. They didn't know what they had expected, maybe a simple tune, a few hesitant chords, but not this. Not something that carried emotion so quietly, yet so clearly. The young man wasn't just pressing keys. He was speaking through them. Customers began turning their heads more fully toward him. A couple who had been whispering stopped mid-sentence. A child who had been swinging his feet under a table suddenly froze, eyes wide. Two students who had been doing homework slowly closed their notebooks. The music wasn't demanding their attention. It was simply too beautiful to ignore. The young man didn't seem aware of any of it. His eyes stayed lowered, focused on the keys, but also far beyond them, as if he was remembering something only he could see. His fingers moved with a touch so careful, it was almost fragile. But each note blended into the next with such smoothness that it was clear, no matter what life had taken from him. Music had stayed. Outside the cafe window, the sky grew darker, deepening into shades of blue and purple. The streetlights flickered on one by one. The glow from inside the cafe seemed warmer now, almost brighter, as if the music itself was adding light. The tune shifted from soft to slightly stronger. Not loud, not forceful, just more filled, like a heart slowly opening. The melody traveled up and down the keys with grace that didn't match his worn clothes or tired eyes. It was the kind of music that made people feel something, even if they didn't know what that feeling was. One of the workers stood quietly near the register, hands resting on the counter. Their eyes softened as they watched him, sensing that this young man wasn't just talented, he was carrying something heavy inside him. Something that poured out through the piano, because he had nowhere else to put it. As the minutes passed, more customers turned their chairs toward the piano. Some held their drinks halfway to their mouths, without taking a sip. Others placed their hands flat on the table, as if steadying themselves. A few people even closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. The cafe, which had been filled with the usual soundscapes clinking, quiet talking, soft footsteps, had become silent except for the piano. It wasn't the silence of boredom or discomfort. It was the silence that happens when people witness something unexpectedly beautiful. The young man's face slowly changed as he played. The tiredness didn't disappear, but something gentler replaced it, something like peace, or maybe relief. His shoulders loosened, and the tremble in his hands faded. It was as though the music was pulling him back to a version of himself he had nearly forgotten. He leaned into the next part of the melody, letting it flow with more confidence. The notes rose lightly, like small sparks drifting upward. Then they dipped again into soft, warm tones. It was a conversation of emotions, hope, sadness, gratitude, longing moving through the keys in a language without words. Someone near the back took out their phone, not to distract themselves, but to record just a few seconds. Not to post online, not yet, but because they wanted to remember what they were hearing. Others eventually followed, lifting their phones quietly, gently, respectfully. No one wanted to break the moment. Still, the young man didn't notice any of it. For him, the world around him had faded away. There was only the music, the keys beneath his fingers, and the breath of emotion coming from somewhere deep inside his chest. The owner slowly walked around the counter and stood a little closer to the piano, though not too close. They didn't want to distract him. They simply wanted to be near enough to listen. Each note felt like a story being told, one that didn't need explanations. As the melody unfolded, the owner found themselves wondering who this young man was. Where had he learned to play like this? How long had it been since he had touched a piano? Why had someone with this kind of gift ended up hungry and exhausted at their door? But those questions stayed quiet. The owner didn't need answers yet. They only needed to listen. The music rose once more into a soft swell, like a sigh. The young man's fingers glided from one end of the piano to the other in a gentle arc, creating a wave of sound that filled the room in a warm rush. Then he slowed, letting the notes settle like falling petals. A woman sitting near the window felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't know why. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was the kind of emotion that comes from witnessing something honest, something that touches the heart without warning. A man near the center of the room leaned forward in his chair, both elbows on the table, chin resting on his hands. He looked as if he were trying to memorize every detail of the moment. A warm drink sat untouched in front of him. Even the cafe's youngest customer, a little girl eating a muffin with her family, stopped chewing. Her eyes were fixed on the piano, her expression soft with wonder. Minutes passed. The song continued its quiet journey. And then something changed. For the first time since he began playing, the young man lifted his gaze just a little. Not fully, not confidently, but just enough for him to notice something he hadn't expected. People were listening. Not just listening, they were moved. He blinked, almost startled. His fingers faltered for a fraction of a second, but he caught himself quickly and kept playing. Still, the realization sank into him like a warm light. He had spent a long time feeling unseen, unnoticed, unneeded. But here, in this small cafe where he had walked in simply hoping for a bite to eat, his music mattered. Not because he was trying to impress anyone, not because he had planned any of this, but because people were hearing him. His back straightened just a little. Not too much, just enough to show he felt a spark of confidence he hadn't felt in months, maybe longer. The music shifted again, becoming more open, more daring, like a bird testing its wings. It didn't lose its softness, but it gained a strength beneath it, a steadiness, a quiet bravery. The owner felt their breath catch slightly. They didn't know much about music, but they knew what they were hearing was special, not just technically, but emotionally. The young man was telling something deeply personal through the keys, something that words would never have captured. More customers entered the cafe, expecting the usual noise and movement, but instead stepping into a world filled with music that felt almost magical. They paused near the door, drawn in instantly. Some stayed there, listening from a distance. Others found empty seats quietly, not wanting to disturb the moment. The cafe had never been this still. Even the buzzing refrigerator behind the counter sounded quieter than usual, as though it too was listening. The young man continued playing, letting the song travel through different emotions. The melody dipped into sadness, soft, tender sadness, the kind that makes the heart ache in a gentle way. Then it brightened again, hopeful and warm. It was like he was walking the audience through his own memories, his own life, without telling them anything directly. The notes floated from his hands like small stories. Stories of moments he had lost. Stories of days that had been heavy. Stories of happier times before everything had changed. Stories of hope he had almost given up on. Stories of gratitude for this one small chance to play, to be heard, to feel human again. The longer he played, the more the cafe transformed. It felt less like a simple coffee shop and more like a safe space, where strangers gathered without speaking but felt connected by the same gentle thread. Some customers began placing their hands over their hearts without thinking. Others rested their palms on the table as if grounding themselves in the moment. A few quietly wiped their eyes. No one felt embarrassed. The music gave them permission to feel. After a while, the song began to approach its end. The young man's fingers slowed, moving with careful intention. The melody softened once more, returning to the quiet tenderness it had begun with. It sounded like a goodbye, not a painful one, but a peaceful, grateful one. The cafe grew even quieter, if that was possible. People leaned in, wanting to catch the final notes. The young man pressed the last few keys with a gentleness that felt like a whisper. The final note lingered in the air, soft and warm, fading slowly into silence. He let his hands fall into his lap. His shoulders dropped, not from exhaustion this time, but from release, like he had finally set down a burden he had been carrying far too long. The cafe remained silent for a few heartbeats. No one wanted to break the moment too soon. And, finally, it came. A soft clap. Then another dot, then more. The applause grew, not loud, not full of warmth. Real warmth. People smiled through misty eyes. Some nodded at him with quiet admiration. Others simply held their hands together, clapping slowly, respectfully. The young man looked down, overwhelmed. He wasn't used to praise. He wasn't used to being seen. He certainly hadn't expected anything. The sound of the applause slowly softened, fading into a warm hush that filled the cafe like a gentle breeze. The young man kept his head lowered for a few seconds longer, unsure of how to react. Praise wasn't something he was used to anymore. Applause felt like a foreign language, soft, kind, and unfamiliar. When he finally looked up, his eyes moved across the room. He wasn't trying to search for anything particular. He just wanted to see if the moment was real. People were smiling at him, not out of pity, but out of genuine appreciation. Some nodded to him respectfully. Others simply held his gaze for a brief moment with a warmth that he hadn't felt directed at him in a long time. He gently pushed back from the piano bench, intending to stand and thank them, but before he could, the cafe owner stepped forward from the side. Their expression carried a mixture of surprise, admiration, and something else, a quiet worry mixed with hope. "Would you like something to eat now?" the owner asked softly. The young man swallowed hard. He hadn't meant to draw attention. He hadn't meant to create a moment. All he wanted was enough food to ease the ache in his stomach. But now the cafe was looking at him as if he had given them far more than what he had asked for. "Yes," he whispered. If that's all right." The owner gave a nod, not rushed, not forced, but filled with sincerity. "Of course. Come sit." The young man hesitated for a moment, as though unsure whether he truly belonged among the tables and warm lights. But the owner gestured again gently, and he finally walked toward one of the empty tables near the front. As he sat down, he kept his hands close together, resting them on his lap. He didn't want to take up space. He didn't want to burden anyone. But the way people glanced at him, with soft smiles and gentle curiosity, made him feel less invisible than he had felt in a long time. The owner went to the counter, and soon a plate was brought to the table. Not a small one, not a single sandwich, but a full, warm meal with a drink beside it. The young man blinked, almost startled by the generosity. "For you," the owner said. He looked up, and his eyes softened with a gratitude so deep he didn't know how to put it into words. "Thank you," he whispered. He ate slowly at first, almost cautiously, like someone who hadn't had the chance to eat comfortably in a long time. But every bite seemed to bring a little more life back into his face. His shoulders eased, his breathing steadied, and he took moments between bites just to take in what was happening around him. People returned to their conversations, but their eyes still drifted toward him now and then, not with judgment only, with a gentle wonder. A few customers whispered softly to each other, trying to describe the feeling the music had left in their hearts. Some replayed the short videos they had recorded, letting the notes wash over them again. A couple sitting nearby looked at the young man with warm smiles. One of them leaned slightly toward him and said, "That was beautiful. Truly." He paused, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to compliments. He wasn't used to being seen. But he managed a soft smile and said, "Thank you. I'm glad you liked it." As he continued eating, the owner took a seat across from him, not intruding, just being present. "You play very well," the owner said gently. The young man lowered his gaze. "I used to play a lot," he said. "A long time ago." "Where did you learn?" the owner asked. The young man paused for a moment, not because he wanted to hide the answer, but because the memories felt heavy. "My mother taught me," he finally said. "She loved music. We had a little keyboard at home when I was younger. I played every day. Later, I learned more on my own, wherever I could." The owner nodded slowly, sensing that the young man wasn't ready to share everything yet. "Well," the owner said with a warm tone, "your music brought a lot of peace to this room." The young man's eyes glimmered with gratitude. "It brings peace to me, too," he said softly. "It's the only thing that still feels like mine." The owner listened quietly, not pushing him to explain more. The cafe had always been a place where people came to rest, to think, to breathe. And tonight, it felt like that space had opened up for the young man as well. After he finished eating, he sat back in his chair, resting his hands gently on his stomach. He looked content, though still somewhat unsure. "You can stay as long as you like," the owner said. The young man nodded. "Thank you. I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not causing trouble," the owner replied. "You're welcome here." For a moment, the young man didn't know what to say. He had heard kindness before, but not like this. Not this open. Not this genuine. As the cafe continued its usual evening rhythm, people slowly came and went. Some stopped by the table to tell him they enjoyed his playing. Others simply smiled as they passed. Every small gesture warmed him in a way he didn't know how to handle. He wasn't used to being treated gently. After a while, the owner returned with a warm drink for him. "On the house," the owner said. The young man held the cup between his hands, feeling the heat seep into his fingers. "You're very kind," he said. The owner shook their heads slightly. "Kindness should be normal," they replied. Those words lingered in the air, settling into the young man's heart. He sipped the drink slowly, letting the warmth spread through him. It wasn't just the drink. It was everything around him. The soft lights, the gentle hum of conversation, the smell of pastries, the faint sound of a spoon stirring in a cup. For once, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like a human among humans. After finishing his drink, he sat quietly for a few minutes, simply listening to the sounds around him. His eyes drifted toward the piano again, the silent, old instrument that had somehow opened a door for him tonight. He didn't plan any of this. He hadn't walked in hoping to impress anyone. He had walked in because hunger had pushed him to try. But now he was sitting in a warm cafe, having eaten a full meal, surrounded by people who appreciated him. It felt almost unreal. A worker approached the table with a gentle smile. "You played beautifully," they said. The young man offered a small smile in return. "Thank you. I didn't expect anyone to listen." "Hard not to listen," the worker said. "You made the room feel different." The young man lowered his gaze, shy but touched. "I'm glad," he said softly. As the evening moved on, more customers arrived. Some noticed the piano, still warm from his playing, and asked curiously, who played earlier? Others whispered about the melody, still echoing faintly in their minds. Eventually, the owner approached him again and asked gently, "Would you like to rest for a bit? Or, if you want to play more later, you're welcome to. Only if you feel up to it." The young man hesitated. "I don't want to take advantage," he said quietly. "You're not," the owner replied. "You brought something special here tonight. It's okay to stay." He nodded slowly. "Maybe. Maybe I'll play again later." The owner smiled. "Whenever you're ready." The young man stood up from the table after a while and walked toward the window. Outside, the night had settled completely. The street was calm, with only a few people passing by. The city lights reflected softly on the pavement. He pressed his hand lightly against the window frame as he looked out. Seeing the world from inside a warm cafe felt different than seeing it from the street. Out there, the world felt big, sharp, and unforgiving. But in here, it felt safe. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warm air of the cafe fill his lungs. He didn't know how long this safety would last. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight he felt seen. He felt heard. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that maybe he hadn't lost everything. A group of customers who had entered earlier whispered to the owner, "Is he a professional?" The owner shook their head. "No idea. He just walked in tonight." The customers looked amazed. "He's incredible." The owner glanced at the young man by the window, his silhouette soft in the warm light. "Yes," the owner said quietly. "He is." The young man eventually returned to the piano, not to play, but to sit on the bench again. He let his fingers rest lightly on the keys, not pressing them, just feeling them. The smoothness beneath his fingertips reminded him of who he once was, someone who had dreams, someone who had a place in the world. He wasn't sure if he deserved the kindness he'd been shown tonight, but he was grateful, deeply grateful. He whispered to himself, "Maybe things can get better." He didn't know if anyone heard him, but the owner, who had quietly stepped closer without interrupting, heard just enough to understand. "Sometimes," the owner said softly, "a small moment can change everything." The young man looked up, surprised. The owner smiled gently. "You gave us something beautiful tonight," the owner said. "Let this place give you something small in return." The young man lowered his eyes, humbled. "Thank you," he said quiet, sincere, full of feeling. Slowly, he looked around the cafe, the tables, the lights, the people. The warmth dot he had come in hungry, but he had found something much deeper than food dot. He had found a place where he wasn't invisible. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself hope. Part 4 story will be placed here ... closing parenthesis. He had never expected people to react the way they did. When the last note of his song faded into the warm air of the cafe, the room stayed quiet for a moment, almost as if everyone wanted those final sounds to rest gently in the space before moving on. Then the applause came soft at first, then growing louder and stronger until it filled every corner of the room. He blinked, unsure whether to look up or keep his eyes on the piano keys. A strange mix of emotions spread through him. Part of him wanted to smile. Another part wanted to run outside just to breathe. For so long, he had been invisible. Music had always been the one thing he felt connected to, but it had been months since he had played in front of anyone. Now, here he was, sitting on a wooden bench in a place he had walked into only to ask for food. And all these people were clapping for him. For his music. For something he had almost given up. The cafe owner approached him with a plate of warm food. He placed it in front of the young man without saying anything at first. The owner wasn't a loud or overly expressive person, but there was something kind in his eyes. The young man looked up and quietly thanked him. The owner pulled up a chair and sat across from him. The room was still buzzing with whispers and soft conversations. People talking about how surprised they were, how beautiful the music had sounded, how they wished they had recorded more of it. The young man picked up the fork and took a small bite. The food was simple rice, a bit of chicken, some vegetables, but to him it tasted like the best meal he had had in a long time. Maybe it wasn't the food itself. Maybe it was the way it was given to him. Not with pity, not with impatience, but with a kind of respect he hadn't felt in months. "You play very well," the cafe owner finally said. The young man paused, swallowing slowly. "Thank you," he said, almost whispering. His voice still carried that tiredness, that weight he had been carrying. "Where did you learn to play like that?" the owner asked. The young man looked down at his food for a moment, as if deciding how much he should say. He wasn't used to talking about himself anymore. For months, his conversations had been quick, limited to small requests or short replies as he moved from place to place. "I learned when I was younger," he said. "I used to play every day. It was a big part of my life." The owner nodded. He didn't press him or ask a lot of questions. He simply let the young man speak at his own pace. There was a moment of silence. The young man took another bite of food, and for a second, he closed his eyes as if letting the warmth settle inside him. People approached the table softly, careful not to overwhelm him. One person simply said, "That was beautiful," before walking away. Another said, "You've got something special," leaving a small tip on the piano even. Though the young man hadn't asked for anything, a couple, who had been sitting close to the piano, came over and asked if he had any recordings, or if he played anywhere regularly. He shook his head. It was clear they didn't know he was living day to day, unsure of where he would sleep next or when he would eat again. The cafe owner leaned forward slightly and asked, "Would you be willing to come back and play again sometime?" The young man stared at him, unsure if he had heard correctly. "You want me to play here again?" "If you want to," the owner said. People liked it. "I liked it." He paused, then added, "And you'll always get a meal when you play here." The young man felt something tighten in his chest. For months, kindness had come in tiny pieces: someone holding a door open, someone offering half a sandwich, someone giving him an old blanket. But this was different. This was trust. And a chance. "I would like that," he said softly. The owner smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Good, you can come any evening. The piano is yours." After finishing his meal, the young man stayed seated for a moment. He looked around the cafe, taking in every detail: the warm lights, the gentle music playing from the speakers now, the faces of people who had listened to him, appreciated him, seen him. He didn't feel like a burden in that moment. He didn't feel like someone who had been pushed aside by life. He felt like himself again, even if just for a moment. Before leaving, he approached the piano one more time. He ran his fingers across the keys, touching them softly. They were slightly warm, but familiar in a comforting way. He whispered a quiet thank you under his breath, maybe to the piano, maybe to the room, maybe to life for giving him this small moment. When he walked out of the cafe, the night air felt different. It wasn't lighter, but it wasn't as heavy as before. The streetlights glowed softly, and the sounds of the city seemed less harsh. He didn't know yet how much that one evening would change things. He didn't know that the videos people recorded were already being shared online. He didn't know that new doors would open, slowly at first, and then more quickly, as more people heard his music. All he knew was that he wasn't as alone as he had felt earlier that day. Someone had given him a chance. Someone had seen him. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a small spark of hope. He walked down the street with his hands in his pockets, the cold biting gently at his fingers, and allowed himself to imagine what might come next, something he hadn't dared to do for a very long time. Part 5 story will be placed here, ... closing parenthesis. The cafe was much busier the next evening, though he didn't know why. He thought it would be quiet, like the day before, with only a few people sitting by the windows or enjoying their meals alone. He didn't expect anyone to be waiting. But when he stepped through the door, he felt dozens of eyes glance up at him. He froze for a moment. His first instinct was to step back outside. He wasn't used to attention, and certainly not to being looked at with curiosity. But then the cafe owner noticed him and waved him in with a warm gesture. As though inviting an old friend, the young man took a slow breath and walked inside. The smell of warm bread and fresh coffee wrapped around him. He wasn't sure what to do at first. Should he go to the counter, sit down, or go straight to the piano? Before he could decide, the owner stepped toward him. "You came back," the owner said with a gentle smile. "Yes." "If that's okay," the young man replied. "It's more than okay. Everyone's been waiting to hear you again." The owner gave a small laugh. "Turns out, people shared your music online last night." "A lot of people." The young man blinked. "They shared it?" "Quite a lot, yes. It spread fast. That's why we're a bit busier today." He didn't know what to say. The idea that people had taken the time to share something he played, something from his heart, felt unreal. It made his chest tighten in a way he didn't fully understand. The owner pointed toward the piano. "Whenever you're ready." He walked to the piano slowly. The bench was in the same place. The keys were the same. The room felt different, though not threatening, just heavier with expectations he wasn't used to carrying. He sat down and rested his fingers on the keys. His hands were slightly shaky at first, but he took a deep breath and let himself settle. Then he began to play. This time, his music was calmer. Not as heavy as the night before, but still filled with emotion. The room grew silent again, people listening so closely that even the soft tapping of coffee cups sounded loud. He didn't try to impress anyone. He didn't try to play perfectly. He simply let the music flow the way it always did when he needed to speak without words. When he finished, the room filled with applause again, stronger than before. He lowered his head, humbled. It still didn't feel real. After the performance, the owner brought him a warm meal. People came up to speak with him again, but this time they stayed longer, asking gentle questions, nothing too personal. Just things like how long he had been playing, or what kind of music he liked. He answered softly, without giving away too much of his life. He was still unsure how much people wanted to know, or how much he felt comfortable sharing. But one older woman sat beside him after everyone else returned to their tables. She had listened closely, her eyes warm and patient. "You have lived through something," she said softly. "I could hear it in your playing." Her voice was gentle, the kind that didn't push or pry. He didn't feel pressured, but something in her tone made him lower his guard just a little. "I used to play in school," he said quietly, "and at home. My family loved it. But life changed. A lot of things happened at once. I lost people close to me. I couldn't keep up with bills. I tried, but things got worse. And then, I didn't have a place anymore." The woman listened without interrupting. He appreciated that. "I carried my music with me," he continued. "But it's hard to hold on to something when you're just trying to survive. Sometimes I would find a piano in a train station or somewhere outside and play for a few minutes, but it was never for long." "Your music kept you going," she said. He nodded. "I guess it did, even when nothing else stayed with me." The cafe owner walked over and joined the conversation. "You should know something," he said gently. "People are asking about you. They want to help." A few musicians came by earlier to ask if you'd be here tonight. He stared at him in surprise. Help? How? Well, some want to collaborate with you. Others want to give you a place to practice. One person even said they want to lend you a keyboard. The young man couldn't process it all at once. He felt overwhelmed, but not in a painful way. More like his heart was too full, trying to absorb too much kindness at once. He put his fork down and took a breath. Why would they want to help me? They don't know me. Some people don't need to know your whole story to want to help, the owner said. Sometimes they just need to see someone's heart. The young man lowered his eyes. He didn't know how to deal with that kind of warmth. He had gone so long without it. After the cafe closed, he helped the owner move chairs and wipe down tables, even though the owner told him he didn't have to. It made him feel useful. It made him feel like he was giving something back. Before he left, the owner handed him a small brown paper bag. There's a sandwich and a muffin in there. For later. He accepted it quietly. Thank you. Come back tomorrow if you'd like, the owner said. We'd be happy to have you. He walked out into the cool night air, holding the bag close to him. The sky was clear, dotted with soft stars. He found a quiet bench down the street and sat for a moment, letting everything wash over him. For months, he had felt like he was fading, like each day was another step into a place where no one saw him, where no one cared whether he existed. But tonight felt different. People had listened to him. They had shared his music. They had spoken to him with kindness, not judgment. They had given him a chance. He leaned back and looked at the stars again. Something inside him felt alive, small, fragile, but alive. That night, as he closed his eyes, he didn't think about all the things he had lost. He didn't think about where he would wake up tomorrow, or whether he would be safe. Instead, he thought about the piano, the sound of the keys, the faces in the cafe, the applause, the warmth of the meal dot, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that something good might be coming. Something small, something slow, but something real. He didn't know yet how much more would unfold in the days ahead. How many people would come to hear him play? How many offers would be made? How many new paths would slowly open? All he knew was this. A single question, can I play for some food? Had given him the first step toward rebuilding a life he thought was gone forever. And the next steps, though still uncertain, suddenly felt possible. Part 6 story will be placed here ... closing parenthesis. The next few days unfolded in a way the young man could never have predicted. Each morning, he woke up uncertain of what the day would bring. Yet each evening ended with something new, a conversation, an opportunity, a moment that made his world feel a little less heavy. Every night, the cafe grew busier. People started arriving earlier, just to make sure they got a seat near the piano. Some brought friends or family members, saying they had to hear the young man who played with his whole heart. Others came alone, wanting a quiet place to sit and feel something real for a little while. The young man tried not to think too much about the attention. He knew if he focused on it too hard, he would freeze. Instead, he let himself fall into the music each time he sat at the piano, letting the notes speak for him, letting the melodies tell stories he didn't have the words for. And every night, the room filled with applause. Not loud, wild applause like at a concert, but gentle, meaningful appreciation, the kind that made his chest warm and his eyes sting with emotion he wasn't used to feeling. One evening, after a particularly emotional performance, a man approached him. He carried a small black case in one hand. "I've been listening to you all week," the man said. "You have a rare gift. I want to give you something." He opened the case slowly. Inside was a small keyboard, portable, but good quality. The young man stared at it, unable to speak. "This is for you," the man said. "I don't use it anymore, and you need an instrument. Something you can practice on when you're not here." The young man shook his head at first. "I can't take this. It's too much." "It's not too much," the man replied softly. "It's the right thing. You deserve tools for your talent." The cafe owner stood nearby, watching the exchange. He stepped forward and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "It's okay to accept help," he said. "People want to support you. Let them." The young man hesitated, then finally nodded. He placed his hands on the keyboard gently, as if afraid it might disappear. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That night, as he walked out of the cafe with the keyboard pressed against his chest, he felt something new, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope wasn't just a faint spark anymore. It was something he could almost hold. In the following days, more people came forward with small acts of kindness. One person brought him a warm coat. Another left a pair of gloves for him at the counter. Someone else offered him a part-time job, helping set up events at a local community center. He didn't know how to take all the kindness at once. Part of him was afraid it would all disappear. But each day, the world seemed to soften around him a little more. One afternoon, after playing at the cafe, the owner invited him to sit for a moment. "You know," the owner said, "a local music teacher came by earlier. She wants to meet you. She said she thinks you could teach some classes, or maybe help with beginner lessons. She was very impressed by your playing." The young man blinked. "Teach?" "Yes," the owner said. "You'd be good at it." He felt a strange sense of disbelief. Teaching had never even crossed his mind. It felt like something meant for people who lived stable lives, people with homes, schedules, and certainty. But then he remembered how many hours he spent practicing in his younger years, how deeply he understood the instrument, how much joy it brought him even during hard times. "Maybe," he said quietly, "maybe I could try." The owner nodded with encouragement. Over the next week, the young man met with the music teacher. She listened to him play, asked him questions, and watched the way he interacted with the instrument. After their meeting, she said, "You have something very special. Not just talent, you have heart. Students can learn technique anywhere, but they learn passion from people like you." She offered him a small teaching position, 2 days a week to start. It wasn't much, but to him, it felt huge. It felt like a step toward a real future. The young man continued to play at the cafe in the evenings. Each night felt like another piece of his life, slowly falling into place. The customers, the conversations, the shared laughter, everything felt warmer, more connected. And even though he still had challenges outside those walls, he didn't feel alone anymore. One evening, after another performance filled with soft, emotional music, the cafe owner sat across from him with a thoughtful expression. "You've changed this place," the owner said. "Your music brings people together. I've never seen the cafe this full or this peaceful." The young man shook his head. "I didn't do anything special." "You did," the owner insisted. "You reminded people what real emotion sounds like. You reminded them to slow down, to feel, to appreciate something honest." The young man sat quietly, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to having such an impact on people. "Let me tell you something," the owner said softly. "You asked me for food that first night, but what you gave us in return is much more than anything I could have offered you." The young man lowered his eyes. His throat tightened with emotion. He had never thought of his music as something that could help others. He only saw it as something that helped him survive. As the weeks passed, he continued teaching at the music center, performing at the cafe, and practicing on the keyboard given to him. Slowly, he felt himself returning to the person he used to be, the person who believed in dreams, who believed in creating something, who believed life could still hold beauty. Then one evening, as he finished a song that drifted softly through the cafe, a group of customers stood and gave him a gentle standing ovation. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was silent, warm, full of appreciation. He sat at the piano, overwhelmed. His hands trembled slightly, but this time not from fear. From gratitude. After the cafe closed that night, he stayed behind, sitting at the piano bench long after the lights were dimmed. The owner stood in the doorway, watching him quietly. "You okay?" the owner asked. The young man nodded, though his voice was soft. I never thought life could feel like this again." The owner stepped closer. "That's the thing about life," he said. "Sometimes it only takes one moment to change the direction. One choice. One question." The young man looked at the piano keys. He remembered the first night, the fear, the hunger, the uncertainty, and his own voice asking softly, "Can I play for some food?" He didn't know then how much that one question would change everything. He ran his fingers across the keys one more time. The owner smiled. "You're not the same person who walked in here that night." The young man took a slow breath. "Maybe not," he said, "but I'm glad I walked in." The owner nodded. "So am I." As the young man stepped outside, the air felt cool and calm. The streetlights glowed softly. The night was quiet, peaceful. He walked down the street with a calmness he hadn't felt in years. His future was still uncertain. Life always carried some uncertainty. But now he had music, a place to belong, people who believed in him, and new paths opening in front of him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking alone. And as he moved forward into the quiet night, he carried one truth deeply within him. Sometimes hope begins with the smallest question. Sometimes a life changes because someone chooses kindness. And sometimes a simple request, "Can I play for some food?" becomes the beginning of a whole new story.